Great, thanks everyone for being here today. I am Melissa Soldevilla, and today I'm going to be telling you about some of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing to understand more about Rice's whales in the Gulf of Mexico by listening to the sounds that they produce to provide information to support their conservation and hopefully recovery. So as humans, we rely on sight to perceive and react to the world around us. However, in the oceans, sound travels much farther than light. So marine mammals typically really rely heavily on sound for communication, navigation, finding food, as well as avoiding threats. Our largest of whales that include the Rice's whales typically tend to produce loud, low-frequency sounds that can travel tens to hundreds of miles. And so as scientists, we can actually start listening for those sounds to start learning more about the whales that we're trying to study. And so this can include providing information about their behavior, about their distribution and range, as well as sometimes, in special occasions, even learning about how many of them are around. So we do this with specialized acoustic tools. These include hydrophones, which are underwater microphones, and these can be deployed in different instrumentation types. And so over on the left here, you can see sonobuoys, which are real-time drifters. We can deploy those during our surveys of specific animals, and they'll be sending back the signals in real time so we can better understand what's going on while we're out there at sea. We also have other instruments that are put out on long-term moorings where they collect these acoustic recordings over time, so we deploy them at a site for multiple months for up to a year. And this really gives us an ability to start understanding these highly migratory whales, particularly for species like the Rice's whales that only might occur infrequently in a given location. So really giving us an opportunity to detect them when they're in that area. And this is really an important thing to do because we can't just go and stick a human out at a site for a year at a time on a ship. So having these instruments gives us a lot of information we wouldn't be able to collect otherwise. So when we start thinking about what sort of research needs we have to be able to get the information we need to conserve these whales, one of our first questions, of course, to use acoustics is what sounds these whales produce, because that's the foundational work that we need. However, once we start getting into the more important questions, then we need to start understanding how often are they occurring within the core habitat, and are they occurring year-round? Are they moving around seasonally? Are they only found within the core habitat or more broadly throughout the Gulf? And then also starting to understand more about human impacts, and so what sort of noise sources might be affecting their habitats. So the very first study that we did with acoustics was to start learning what sounds Rice's whales make, because this is critically important. If you're going to put an acoustic instrument on the seafloor and bring back these recordings, you actually need to know what sounds you're looking for. So in 2018 and 2019, we were able to go out and conduct multiple surveys where we were able to deploy some of those sonobuoys that I showed you before and start getting these sounds and figure out if we heard a sound, could we localize it, and then have our visual observers help us figure out what they were. So some of the sounds that we were curious about included this one, the long moan call. And also these down sweep sequences. So we were able to detect these calls and we were able to localize them. And once we had those locations then from the ship, we were able to send the ship over, and our visual observers were able to detect what it was that was there that was making the sound. And so on 10 occasions then we were able to match our acoustic locations with positively identified Rice's whales. And so from this we were able to discover that these whales do in fact produce these down sweep sequences and long moan calls that you can see here, as well as some tonal sweep sequences that frequently follow the long moan calls, and you might have seen in one of the earlier talks today. So now that we have this core information and know what sounds the whales make, we can start asking a lot more interesting questions. And so since 2010, we've been deploying a HARP, which is one of these long-term acoustic recorders in that sort of core habitat area where we knew Rice's whales occurred. And so as part of this study, then, we've been collecting these data over time nearly continuously. And what we're starting to find then are that Rice's whales are pretty much constantly within this habitat. And so we were able to detect them over these 8 years on 95% of days. So this really highlights how important this habitat is for these whales. And surprisingly, we started to see that there was also what appears to be a seasonal pattern here, where we start to get increased detections in the fall and decreased detections in the spring. As we're recording the sound, we can also record the ambient noise levels, which you can see here, and so that helps us to understand whether noise levels might be impacting our ability to detect the whales. So then we started expanding on this work. We were really getting that seasonality from just a single site within the habitat, and so we wanted to better understand what's going on more broadly throughout the habitat. So for 2 years, from 2021 to 2023, we deployed an array of 18 acoustic moorings throughout the habitat, and these were basically acoustically covering almost the entire habitat. And so this starts to give us information so we can start understanding, are they moving offshore and onshore seasonally? Are they moving north-south? What's going on? How are they using this habitat? Which is critically important for understanding what anthropogenic impacts might be overlapping with where the whales are and when. So here you can start to see some of the data that we're getting back. So we've got 18 sites, and here we've got 18 panels. And so we've got the offshore line on the left, we've got the inshore line on the right, and then each of the instruments from north to south. And so what we start to see when we look at these, just a quick hint, those sort of light gray areas are where we don't have data, and then the dark gray is what we're looking at. And so what we start to see is that we have far more acoustic detections on the inshore line than we do on the offshore line. And then we start to see that there appears to possibly be a seasonal movement where the whales are detected more commonly in the northern part of the array during the summertime, and then more commonly in the southern part of the array during the wintertime. Now at this point, this is just 1 year of data that we're looking at, and so we can't really claim seasonality until we see if this pattern holds over multiple years. So we're continuing to investigate that. So then we want to know what's going on in the core habitat, but we also want to understand whether they occur more broadly throughout the Gulf of Mexico. And so in 2016 to 2017, for 1 year, we deployed 5 HARPs along the shelf break habitat where we most likely thought they might occur based on the bathymetry preference we see in the east. And so in this case, we were able to then get a year's worth of recordings at these sites, and we found that at the 3 westernmost sites, we did in fact get acoustic recordings of Rice's whale calls. And so we detected almost 2,000 calls on the westernmost site, with whales detected on 16% of days. So that's approximately on average once a week. As Barb told you, we've heard them through all seasons at that site, and this information really then provided the first evidence that some Rice's whales are persistently occurring beyond the core habitat. Interestingly, we also got these different calls on the western sites, and so it's a variant of the long moans. We hear them on the western sites and occasionally on a site in the east, but we've never heard any of the eastern calls on the western sites. So this is still a mystery what this actually means, but it might suggest that there's movement between the western and eastern sites. So we're continuing to expand on this work. So we've got quite a few acoustic recorders throughout the Gulf. Some of these are focused on Rice's whales, some are focused more broadly on other marine mammals within the Gulf. And this is starting to give us a lot more information to ask questions about whether they occur in the southern Gulf or whether they occur in deeper waters, or really are they just focused on that narrow shelf break strip. So what we're finding so far is that, yes, for any time that we put an instrument in that sort of 100 to 400 meter isobath region, we are detecting Rice's whale calls. And you can see this on the map as the pie charts at each of our sites. That orange represents the proportion of days that calls were detected, where the black represents the days they're not detected. And so we can start to get a sense of really which areas are they occupying most. So once we start looking into more of the deeper waters and into the south, in the south we haven't yet sampled within that 100 to 400 meter isobath range, and so it's still unknown what's going on down there. But so far in the deeper waters, we have never heard a Rice's whale call. Now we're doing passive acoustics, and these whales don't have to call in, so it's possible if we're not hearing calls that means they're not there, but it also could mean that they just don't call when they're there, so they might be traveling through and not making sounds, or it could mean that we can't detect their calls when they're there, possibly because of the way that sound propagates or because of the noise conditions that might mask their sounds. So we know that the Gulf of Mexico is heavily industrialized. There are numerous human activities that occur in the Gulf that occur within the low frequency range. And so here you can hear what a shipping noise sounds like as it's passing by for a 30-minute second. And so these different noise, in both shipping noise as well as air gun surveys, are the two dominant sources of noise within the Gulf of Mexico. This bit that we're listening to right now just represents a short duration, but these ships are kind of coming and going. And so as you look at them over a 12-hour period, you can see them coming and going. Now, when we start thinking about air gun surveys, which you can hear now, going back to this shorter 1-minute representation, you can see these are these impulsive signals. And so a ship is typically having these signals occur about every 10 seconds or so. And then you might have multiple ships all acting at the same time throughout the Gulf of Mexico. So when we have all of this noise within the Gulf, it's going to have an impact on our ability to detect calls, but it also has potential to be impacting the whales. We know that noise sources can cause stress to whales, and it also has the potential to mask their own ability to hear sounds that are biologically important to them. So here we can start to look at, because we're recording these sounds of the marine mammals, we're also recording ocean soundscapes. And so we can start to look at how noise and long-term soundscapes vary around the Gulf of Mexico. So in the map over on the right, you can see the locations of 15 sites that we had out in a given year. And then over on the left, you can see panels representing 10 of those sites and the noise conditions that were recorded there over the course of 1 year. And when we look at these, the sort of warmer orange-red colors represent where we have louder sound levels. And so I'm going to kind of walk you through these panels a little bit. So here we're looking at one of the sites, and you see all of that really dark red and dark orange, and that represents the air gun surveys that we're hearing in the sort of 10 to 100 hertz frequency range. And you can see approximately 80% of the year you're seeing these signals coming in at that site. So this is really highlighting how air gun surveys are the dominant source of low frequency noise within the Gulf of Mexico. Now, when we start looking more broadly across all of the sites, then we start to see that the temporal patterns of those increases in noise and decreases in noise all line up. And so I've highlighted that here in this rectangle, and I'll continue to highlight it in a few more. And so this means that we are hearing the same air gun surveys on all of the sites around the Gulf of Mexico, where these sites are hundreds of kilometers apart. And so really, a single air gun survey is affecting the entire Gulf of Mexico. Air gun surveys are not the only source of noise, and so shipping noise is also ubiquitous, and you can see that here in these boxes that I've highlighted in the 50 to 100 hertz range. And so you can see at all of the sites we also have shipping noise. However, again, we'll notice that that shipping noise is really being masked by the air gun surveys here that are just really drowning them out across most of the period. And these air gun noise also have the potential to mask the sounds of Rice's whales, as I've mentioned. One of the things, the last thing I wanted to highlight on here is that we do have one site, and that's the one that I showed you earlier that's from the Rice's whale core habitat. And you can see that that one site that I've highlighted with the black box is kind of more of those cool colors, blues and greens. And this is because this is the quietest area within the Gulf of Mexico. We can look at these data in another way, so taking those sort of long-term averages and just getting an average noise level at each of the sites and mapping them out, and again with these colors representing the warmer colors representing louder noise levels. And when we start to look here at the 3 sites where we've heard Rice's whales before, the median noise levels here are 10 to 20 decibels quieter at these sites, and decibels are a log scale, and so this means that these sites are 2 to 4 times quieter. So this leads to a question: are the Rice's whales preferentially seeking out quieter habitat, or is this because we're using passive acoustic methods that rely on sound, are we just not detecting them in other places where they might be occurring, but the noise is too loud for us to hear them? So to summarize what we've learned, in the core habitat, we discovered 3 call types that the Rice's whales are producing, and we're able to use that information to learn more about their occurrence. We found that they are occurring 95% of days over the entire 8-year period at the site within the core habitat. And then when we looked more broadly at the array of data, we're starting to see what seems to be a seasonal shift to the north during the spring and summer and south in the fall and winter, although we need more data to confirm that. When we look more broadly around the Gulf, we found that some whales are persistently occurring along that northwestern Gulf of Mexico shelf break, which is new knowledge that we hadn't had previously, is critical for understanding given how heavily industrialized that portion of the Gulf is. And at this time, we haven't yet detected them in deeper waters, so this may mean that they're limited to that shelf break habitat. And finally, when we start thinking about chronic noise levels, the sites that have Rice's whales present have the lowest noise levels, and we find that these low-frequency noise levels are really dominated primarily by airgun survey noise and secondarily by shipping noise. So moving forward, what is there still to do? Lots. One of the main things, we want to keep those arrays going within the core habitat so that we can continue having our long-term monitoring of population trends, being able to quickly detect if there's a decline going on, if they're steady, or hopefully that they start recovering. We're also working on passive acoustic density estimations to try to get numbers of animals based on these arrays, and we're doing some acoustic tracking, which allows us to get tracks and movement patterns of the whales, which might give us information to better understand how they're responding to threats. Thinking more broadly Gulf-wide, we are doing our best. We are planning this summer to get 10 instruments out along the shelf break within Mexico and hoping that that'll give us the information that we need to understand if they are a transboundary stock. We'll also be putting an array out in the northwestern Gulf, again being able to start looking at how many animals and what sort of densities of them we might have over out the west to compare to the eastern Gulf. And potentially, if we can keep these long-term monitoring sites going over time, this might start giving us information about climate impacts. And so then there's all the stuff that we need to do about chronic noise levels. So it's critical that we want to be able to keep these quiet areas quiet. So specifically the places where we are most commonly detecting Rice's whales, making sure those are now the quietest areas, let's keep them that way. But then as part of the restoration projects that we're doing with the Deepwater Horizon oil spill restoration, we're starting to work and collaborate with industry to figure out how can we start reducing noise impacts from airgun surveys and shipping noise throughout the Gulf to make it a more habitable area to live in all over. So all of this work relies on many, many people, and so I would like to acknowledge my co-authors that you can see here in the middle, the many funding sources that contributed to this, as well as the many people who were involved in the fieldwork and analyses. And I thank you all for listening.
Now we have time for 1 or 2 questions. And we again, go ahead. That's okay, just shout.
Is there possibly do you think having a seasonality of when those airgun surveys will be kind of in correspondence with like breeding or something else with rice flows? Do you think that would be a solution to help them? Because obviously it's going to be hard to stop testing, but with a seasonality like on the fishing.
Right, so I think we do know that Rice's whales are in the Gulf year-round, so there's not necessarily a real seasonality to their occurrence within the Gulf, and those airgun noises are heard at all sites around, and so I think there's a lot of new technologies that are available to be able to do surveys in a different way, and so there's your typical airgun surveys, but then there's also tuned pulse sources and vibrosize, which are quieter methods, and so those are being investigated and are probably going to be the best way to actually reduce noise levels at the source.
Thank you, Melissa.